Hi everyone and welcome to Standard Deviant School Nutrition. I'm Herschel Bliefeld. This is macronutrients, fats. Of the three macronutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, and fat may be the most misunderstood. Most people hear the word fat and they think about heart attacks, clothes that don't fit. While too much fat can be really unhealthy, no fat is unhealthy too. So fat does a lot of good things for the body. In this episode, we're going to cover the ins and outs of this misunderstood macronutrient.
First up are all the good properties of fat. Then we'll go into the different types of fats, a little bit of chemistry, and the health effects of fat. Then we'll travel the wide world of fat digestion. It'll be more fun than you think. Hang on.
Contrary to popular belief, we actually need some fat in our diets to keep us healthy. There are three basic functions food fats perform in our bodies. First, they are a fuel source for energy. Second, they supply essential nutrients to the body. And third, they give our food flavor and texture.
As a fuel source for energy, food fats supply a basic continuing source of fuel for the body. This allows the body to store and burn fuel as needed for energy. Fats have 9 kilocalories of energy per gram, compared to carbohydrates at 4 kilocalories per gram. This means that when other energy sources are depleted, fat sticks around and continues fueling the body. Not too shabby, huh?
Second, food fats also provide essential nutrients to our bodies in the form of fatty acids. The human body can make all but 2 fatty acids.
Hold on a minute. I believe there's a term you forgot to define.
Human body?
No.
Nutrients.
No.
Bubblegum?
No. Bubblegum? No, fatty acids. Move over. Prepare to learn, students.
A fatty acid is a chain of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached. The acid part of the word comes from this contraption, an acid group. The number of carbon atoms can go up to 24. Those little sticks you see between the atoms are called bonds. Think of it like they're holding hands.
Yes, holding hands. Oh, sweet Penelope. Why did you leave me? Life is now like an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia without the volume love. Yes,
Often, one or more of the carbons in the fatty acid will have double bonds. It'll look like this symbol. When there's a double bond, that leaves one less place for a hydrogen. Sometimes you'll see a fatty acid drawn like this. The squiggly line is shorthand for all those carbons. If there are double bonds, you'll see this line. Each place there's a double bond.
Those symbols will pop up again, like in 10 seconds, so keep them in mind. Okay, so fat is a fuel source for energy. The second function of fats is that they provide essential nutrients to our bodies in the form of fatty acids. The human body can make all but 2 fatty acids. The 2 our body doesn't make are linoleic acid and linolenic acid. Recognize the symbols? We couldn't live without these 2 fatty acids, so they're called essential fatty acids. The only way to get these fatty acids is from food. Most vegetable oils and meats supply us with these 2 essential fatty acids.
Third, fats also satiate or satisfy the body longer than carbohydrates. Fats also provide some of the flavor in foods. In short, fats may not make us feel as full as fiber or other carbohydrates, but they give us a feeling of satisfaction. They satiate us. Fat.
Fats are actually a subset of lipids, the name for all fatty acids and fat-related compounds. Lipid. Hey cats, Froggy here. You know there are 3 types of lipids: triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Triglycerides are just 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. Just think of glycerol like a magnet for fatty acids. About 95% of lipids in foods are triglycerides. The other 5% is made up of phospholipids and sterols. You've probably heard of the most well-known sterol before. It's cholesterol. Lipid. Cholesterol helps build brain cell membranes, and it helps make some essential hormones for your body. It's so important, in fact, that your liver produces all the cholesterol your body needs. That's why cholesterol in food has a bad rap. You don't need any more of it, and if you get too much, you increase the risk of fatty acids clogging up your arteries. Now let's learn some more about fatty acids.
There are two types of fatty acids, saturated and unsaturated.
When something is saturated, it's got as much of something as it can stand, right? When a fatty acid is saturated, it's got as many hydrogens as there are places for hydrogens to go. The fatty acid is saturated with hydrogens. It's completely hydrogenated. Now, when a fatty acid is missing a hydrogen or two, it's not as hydrogenated as it could be, and we say it's an unsaturated fatty acid.
Three terms designate the degree of saturation in food fats: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. Let's take a closer look at these 3 degrees of saturation.
First, saturated fats are fats composed of saturated fatty acids. What are they saturated with? Hydrogen, that's right. These food fats mostly come from animals. Second, monounsaturated fats are made up mostly of fatty acids with 2 less hydrogen atoms making 1 double bond. These come mostly from plant sources. Olive oil is an example.
Third, polyunsaturated fats are made up mostly of unsaturated fatty acids with 4 or more places unfilled with hydrogen atoms creating double bonds. These fats come from plants like safflower and sunflower oils. No one fat type is 100% saturated or unsaturated. It's a combination of poly, mono, and saturated fatty acids.
Fats shouldn't supply more than 25% to 30% of the body's well-balanced diet. About 2/3 of these should come from unsaturated fats, or vegetable oils, rather than animal food products or saturated fats.
The reason for this is that saturated fat promotes the clogging of your arteries much more than unsaturated fats. The fatty acids in saturated fats are less flexible than the fatty acids in unsaturated fats. That's why butter, which is high in saturated fat, is hard, while olive oil, high in polyunsaturated fat, is liquid.
Remember, all types of fat still have 9 kilocalories per gram. But different types of fat have different effects on blood cholesterol. And depending on the person and their needs, this can be good or bad. If you get more than 10% of your daily calorie intake from saturated fat, the amount of total cholesterol in your body will go up. Plain and simple.
Monosaturated fat shouldn't raise your cholesterol much if less than 15% of your K-calories come from it. And substituting saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat may actually decrease total cholesterol.
Okay, so now that we know what fats are, let's look at how they're broken down in our bodies for digestion.
All fats have the same basic structure, a fatty acid attached to a glycerol base. You don't need to worry about what a glycerol is. Just know that it's an anchor of sorts that holds fatty acids. If there is one fatty acid attached to a glycerol base, that's called a monoglyceride. If there are 2 fatty acids, it's called a diglyceride. And when a glycerol is attached to 3 fatty acids, you guessed it, it's a triglyceride.
Fat digestion is the process of changing basic fuel fats, like butter, into refined fuel fats that can be burned by the cells for energy. This just means that a food source like fat is broken down to a simpler form like fatty acids. There are several steps in the fat digestion process.
The fat digestion process begins in the mouth, where fat is broken down for passage into the stomach. This is not really a chemical process. You just chew your food into small particles and moisten it for its journey.
The next step in the fat digestion process occurs when the fat hits the stomach. There isn't a whole lot of chemical breakdown of fat in the stomach either. The involuntary act of peristalsis, involuntary muscle contractions, breaks down the fats somewhat. Lipase is the only enzyme in the stomach that specifically breaks down fats. It works on butter fat. While other nutrients of the food mix are broken down by enzymes, fats are separated and made more accessible for the small intestine, which is where the real action is.
The last step in the fat digestion process is when the fat reaches the small intestine. Once fat reaches the small intestine, it begins the process of being chemically broken down. A lipase, which works on emulsified butter fat, breaks apart the triglyceride, separating the fatty acids from the glycerol. Now the fatty acids and the glycerol are small enough to be absorbed. Then, enzymes carry the fat into the walls of the small intestine to begin the process of absorption.
But that sounds easier than it actually is. Fats are difficult to absorb into the bloodstream because they're not soluble in water, and blood is mostly water. Fat, therefore, always needs a solvent carrier. We'll explain soon.
Once in the small intestine, fat is chemically broken down by bile and pancreatic lipase. Let's look at each of these substances and what they do.
First of all, bile is produced by the liver. Once manufactured by the liver, the bile is sent to the gallbladder, which secretes the bile into the small intestine. Bile is an emulsifier. Great, so what does that mean? Well, basically, as an emulsifier, the bile takes the fat that's floating around in the small intestine and breaks it down into smaller chunks. It's important that you realize that this is not a chemical process. The bile isn't digesting the fat or anything, it's just breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces.
By doing so, the surface area of the fat in the small intestine is increased, giving the enzyme that eventually digests the fat more of a surface area to work with.
Once the fat has been broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, it's time for digestion to begin. The pancreas manufactures and secretes the fat-digesting enzyme, pancreatic lipase. Let's see what happens to a triglyceride that finds itself in the small intestine. Remember from earlier that we told you a triglyceride is a glycerol base with 3 fatty acids attached. The pancreatic lipase then breaks off one of the fatty acids, turning the triglyceride into a diglyceride. The pancreatic lipase then breaks off another fatty acid, converting our diglyceride into a monoglyceride.
Eventually, although it's a pretty slow process, the last fatty acid is broken off and we're left with a lone glycerol. This happens with all the fats that are brought into the body, and we end up with a bunch of fatty acids and glycerols in the small intestine.
You know what that sound means? Pudding Congo line?
We like pudding, cha-cha. We like pudding, cha-cha. We like pudding, cha-cha.
Now back to fat digestion.
Okay, so what's next?
Next, the bile joins up with the newly broken down fatty acids and glycerols and carries them into the wall of the small intestine. Here, the bile drops off the fatty acids and glycerol and says, "See ya!" It heads for the bloodstream where it's taken to the liver and the whole process starts over. Meanwhile, we've got these fatty acids and glycerols sitting in the small intestine. And here's the cool part. There are all these different types of fats that we eat and bring into our bodies, from animals, from plants. Here's where all those different fats are converted into the fat that's used by our bodies.
All these fatty acids, monoglycerides, and glycerols in your small intestine have the same goal, to make it into your bloodstream. The way they get there, however, depends on their size. Glycerols and small fatty acids are absorbed directly into the cells of the small intestine and then into the bloodstream. Large fatty acids and monoglycerides have a longer path to travel. They're surrounded by a group of water-soluble proteins, forming a spherical structure called a micelle. The micelle helps carry the fatty acids and monoglycerides to the bloodstream.
A micelle carries about 20 fatty acids and monoglycerides into intestinal cells. Now that the micelles have helped them into the intestinal cells, the monoglycerides and fatty acids are reassembled into new triglycerides. Now, these brand new triglycerides and other large lipids are packed into another vehicle called a chylomicron. This protein triglyceride complex is the vehicle that transports lipids from the intestinal cells into the lymph system and eventually into the bloodstream to be put to use by the body.
Chylomicron. This is one popular vehicle. Now, I don't know if you have any triglycerides or large lipids running around at home. I know I do. This baby can sure pack them in. She is a beaut.
By the way, a similar thing happened when the broken down fatty acids and glycerols were sitting in the small intestine. Without getting into too much detail, the fatty acids and glycerols are not only insoluble in the water that's in the small intestine, but they're also repelled by the wall of the small intestine. That's why the bile formed up with the fatty acids and glycerols to carry them into the wall of the small intestine. This is called a solvent carrier system. Now, let's look at the option of fat replacements in our diets.
Food manufacturers are struggling to produce fat replacements that imitate the creaminess and taste of fat without the K-calories. Most of the fat replacements under development are based on one of the 3 energy-yielding nutrients: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Carbohydrate derivatives such as dextrins, which are modified food starches and gums, have been used for years as thickeners and stabilizers.
Olestra is a recently released fat-based fat replacement that is kilocalorie free. It is indigestible and cannot be absorbed. Olestra carries some fat-soluble substances out of the body. Basically, fat-soluble just means anything that dissolves in fat, like cholesterol and some vitamins. This may result in lower blood cholesterol, but has the potential to interfere with fat-soluble vitamin absorption, like vitamin E absorption.
The concern with fat replacers is that consumers will use them in addition to other fats rather than in lieu of other fats. If used properly, they may help individuals lower their fat intake while still enjoying the flavors and textures previously reserved for high-fat foods.
Negative effects of fat replacers when eaten in excess include abdominal cramping and diarrhea. That's just what happens when you try to beat nature.
Okay, it's time to step back and see what we remember about fats. First off, another word for fats is lipids. There are three basic functions food fats perform in our diets. First, they are a fuel source for energy. Second, they supply essential nutrients to the body. And third, they add to food satiety.
Fats are actually a subset of lipids, the name for all fatty acids and fat-related compounds. One of the most well-known lipids is cholesterol. A saturated fat is a fat that is filled with as much hydrogen as it can take. An unsaturated fat is not as hydrogenated. Fat digestion mainly occurs in the small intestine. Bile and pancreatic lipase are the agents responsible for the breakdown of fat in our bodies.
I'm Christiana Knight. Thanks for watching Standard Deviant School.
If you've already learned about carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, check out this bonus review of the digestion process. It covers the digestion of the 3 macronutrients from start to finish.
Okay, so we've looked at how carbohydrates, fats, and proteins work in our bodies. But let's see how they work together in the digestion process. After all, how often are you going to eat a bowl of butter or a loaf of bread by itself? So let's follow some food through the digestive tract and see how all of the digestive organs work together to get the job done.
Suppose you've taken a bite of a ham sandwich. This tasty bite of food contains fat, protein, and carbohydrate. Once in your mouth, you begin chewing the food. Enzymes in the saliva begin to break down the carbohydrate into smaller sugar units, while a pancreatic lipase enzyme for breaking down the fat is released from the tongue. The food bolus travels down the esophagus to the stomach. In the stomach, another lipase is released to work on the fat. So the 2 lipases now begin to break down the fat into smaller units. At the same time, pepsin, an enzyme which breaks down protein, is released and begins to break down the protein into smaller units and amino acids.
The food next passes into the small intestine where the major digestion and absorption of nutrients occurs. The pancreas releases pancreatic amylase into the small intestine, which breaks down carbohydrates into simple monosaccharides or disaccharides. Special enzymes released from the intestine walls break down the disaccharides into monosaccharides, and these simple sugars are absorbed.
The pancreas also releases lipase into the intestine, which breaks down the triglycerides, molecules of glycerol with 3 fatty acids attached, into separate fatty acids and glycerols. Bile is made in the liver and stored in the gallbladder. When it enters the small intestine, the bile helps the fat become more soluble so the lipase enzyme can do its job of breaking down fats into fatty acids and glycerols. The fatty acids and monoglycerides are now absorbed into the intestinal walls. The pancreas also releases protein-breaking enzymes into the small intestine. These enzymes break down the protein fragments into short peptides and amino acids, which can be absorbed by the intestinal cells.
The absorbed sugars from the carbohydrate enter the bloodstream. The amino acids from the protein travel to the liver through the portal vein, which is the vein that carries blood from the GI tract to the liver, where the amino acids are converted to glucose, fat, or put back into protein structures. In the small intestine, the fatty acids from the fat are packaged into chylomicrons, which take lipids from the intestinal cells into the body. The chylomicrons enter the blood through the lymphatic system.